Thank you for listening to Organic News here on Awake Radio, where we try to give you news that is organic. Good evening again. Thank you for tuning in to Organic News here on Awake Radio. And I wanted to say we have a really good guest. Eddie Craig is with us, and it's following a really good theme from the Save Long Island Forum weekend that we just had out at the Upsky Hotel in Hopawk. And a lot of good information, a lot of good speakers. I'm going to be playing Bill Still's presentation in the second half an hour. Part of the second hour is going to be Bill Still's presentation, also with Krisanne Hall's presentation. And so for the first hour, we're going to have Eddie Craig, who is another patriot and who is with us. So thank you and welcome to Awake Radio, Eddie.
Well, thank you for having me on.
I have your bio up here. You have the Rule of Law Radio, and go ahead.
I'm actually a co-host on it. It's not mine. I am one of the added members to it. I came several years after it had come into existence, but yeah, I'm one of the co-hosts.
Okay, and it says that you are an Air Force veteran that began realizing the government was lying to the people at virtually every turn. You began your research into the government rules and statutes in the mid-90s after you witnessed your mom break down into tears over a property tax bill, and they were threatening to take her property away.
That's correct.
And they're right. I mean, it's natural to get angry at the complete callousness and inhumanity of the system. And so, like that made you start looking into how things are run and what did you find out?
Well, that's where the part about lying at every turn comes in. Basically, I found out that government officials and bureaucrats tend to never read the rules under which they pretend to operate. They basically make it up as they go along. They insist it means something and gives them a power they do not actually have. And then when you can use their own rules to prove that what they're doing doesn't comply, they will find other ways to attempt to retaliate against you for holding them to what their limits are.
Yeah, I know that feeling. I mean, I've been, like exactly. This is stuff, my own research. That's exactly what I've found myself. And they just sort of use their uniform and their position, and people just kind of even automatically just bow to that.
Pretty much, yeah. It has a lot to do with the decades of indoctrination into accepting governmental authority over common sense and right and wrong at all costs. That's, in my opinion, that's the biggest reason the Department of Education was invented, to facilitate the government subterfuge of the mindset of freedom and liberty.
Yeah. I have issues with, because I think a lot of this stuff goes back to the family system. Like most people are brought up in that kind of an environment where you can't question, the parent, the father, like you're kind of raised, a lot of times, not all the time, in an atmosphere of fear, and you just, they kind of like the rule by fear.
And that's true. To me, there's always been a big difference between parental authority, someone who's completely responsible for the things that you do and the way that you're brought up and the way that you view other people and their rights along with your own. And that's a very big difference from a nanny state. And we never established a nanny state. That's been foisted upon us completely against our will, and nowadays completely without our knowledge of what's actually happening.
And so you got started in this in right, it says the mid 1990s. And so like how have you been teaching people since then? And what you know what else have you found? Because you've researched extensively about how to handle I saw the video about how to handle like when you get stopped by a cop for for anything like on the street, or I think even like for tickets or something like on
Yeah, well, besides the 14 years active duty in the Air Force and several years as an active reserve, I also am an ex-deputy sheriff from Nacogdoches County, my home county. And a lot of the training that these officers receive, it would astound you at how the public is painted in the eyes of law enforcement as everyone's a crook, everyone's a criminal, and the moment you think otherwise, they'll be the one that kills you. Every officer hits the street with the mindset that every person out here wants me dead, to the point where they actually go out of their way to create situations where that ultimately winds up being true.
Well, I mean that's clearly not the case. I mean, and cops have to know that. I mean, they have to know that like the public does not want to kill them.
Knowing it and accepting it for the purpose of being able to maintain an air of authority, whether it's right or wrong,
Yeah.
that's a whole different matter. They're taught in this training that control of every situation is paramount. Without control, you're dead. That's exactly the mindset they leave them in.
Right. I'm, what I just, thought of was, and I would like to get your take on that, the verdict in the Kelly Thomas case.
If I had to give a straight up honest opinion, I would say either the grand jury indictment itself was astounding, the fact that they even got that far. But the jury decision, I honestly believe, based upon the evidence that should have been presented to them, I didn't get to see everything about the case. But if they got to see everything that I saw, this jury was tampered with in more ways than one. They were either threatened,
yeah, that's
or something was withheld, or they were told they couldn't consider it. But they were tampered with in some form of fashion to come out with the verdict they did.
Yeah, absolutely. I completely agree. I mean, it's so blatant. That video that everyone sees was presented in the court. I mean, how is that possible that they get away with it after witnessing that video? I mean, it's ridiculous. And I looked up the name of the lawyer that defended those the two officers, and I read a statement or something that he made, and he said something about that Kelly Thomas was prone to violent outbursts. But in that entire video that we see, there is no demonstration of that man having any kind of a violent outburst. I mean, and even if he did, he was unarmed.
Oh, absolutely. Many of the things they do, there's no reason to escalate that far. But it's one of the things that I teach people about encounters with cops, especially when the cop initiates it. For instance, very few people understand and realize that anytime you're pulled over for a traffic stop, the officer has a specific agenda already set out.
Exactly.
His job is to escalate that stop from a simple stop to either a DUI or a drug bust. That's what he's truly seeking to end with when the moment he pulls you over. And that also is a part of their training. And to answer your other question about how the jury could conceive what we saw versus what they saw and come up with the conclusion they did, that goes back to our original point in the beginning regarding indoctrination and education. They see that as long as the prosecution and the state assert this is within acceptable policy, then it's okay. So the jury goes, oh, well, it's within department policy, so there can't be anything wrong with it. Okay.
Well, then, right, then that would kind of lead you to say that then there's obviously something wrong with their policy.
Well, if you were a thinking individual, that is true. But one thing I never blame on a jury these days is thinking.
Right. You mean they don't do much thinking?
Exactly.
And I kind of wanted to, do you remember or have you seen the documentary Freedom to Fascism by Aaron Russo?
Yes, I have. And know
Right.
several of the people actually that are in it.
Right. And the juror Marcy Brooks, who I bring that up only because there were some thinking jurors in that.
Exactly. Yeah, the Whitey Harrell case.
Yeah, and even though, okay, like, it's a case like far removed from Kelly Thomas, uh, I mean, like, right, like, and it was, that's why we need, educated people. I mean, that's why we need to rely on the public. I mean, because, you put some, God forgive me, but like dumbed down, people in the jury on like a murder case. And right, if that's exactly what they were telling the jury, like you just said about, oh, this is department, policy, and that's the way that it turned out, then that means that they're not guilty of killing this guy. I mean, like that's pretty scary, to not have a public, an informed, thinking public to rely on.
Well, agreed. The problem, however, is that most people, as I have learned and through what I teach, the majority of Americans, especially these days, have absolutely no idea just how far reaching their rights truly are. They believe their rights
Exactly.
are limited strictly to what the Constitution says, and then only as their government applies them. When in fact, that is the farthest thing from the truth that you can imagine. But the school system has been very good at supplanting the truth with that concept of rationalization and thought.
And then, that also goes, into why they're using like war and terrorism, and saying that they have a right to take even more of your rights away because, oh, we have a war going on. Oh, terrorism. The boogeyman is around every single corner. And, it's really frustrating for me, living over here in New York. And when I get on the subway and every time they play that announcement about, if you see something, say something. And, then they'll play like the other announcement about, oh, this is an announcement from your New York City Police Department. Like your bags, we have a right to search your bags. And it's like they're just prepping people and getting them, ready for, to just lose their freedoms.
Well, that's correct. It's all about that indoctrination process to accept it without resistance.
And a lot
They expend a lot less money and a lot less manpower if they can get you to accept it without a fight.
of people do believe that, that's, a lot of people do believe that, that terrorists are attack the World Trade Center and they're jealous of our freedoms. Do you have a response to
Well, that's
that?
a
If you
complete and utter lie. They don't hate us because of our freedoms. They hate us because we fight terrorism by becoming the very terrorists that we say we're fighting against. Our
exactly,
foreign policy is the entire reason that America is the target of terrorism.
there's
I
that word
mean,
policy
it,
again.
yeah, if you go to some foreign land and where you don't belong, you have no authority and you shouldn't be there in the first place, and you use your military to kill women, children, families, decimate property, bomb it into oblivion, you're creating terrorists with that policy.
Well, right, and I'm a big stickler for like the words and the language that you use. So, using the word terrorist to describe people who are basically, having a normal reaction to seeing their family members being blown up is not a terrorist. But
Exactly. But
like
they count on your support
yes,
by using the most evil descriptors they can come up with to
exactly.
describe the victims of their own actions in order to vilify them to us and justify what they do in the process.
Do you?
If the people of America ever woke up in mass and fully understood the extent of where this government for the last few decades has actually led this nation,
Oh God.
they would all be decorating a lamppost before sundown.
Right. Do you have an opinion on 9/11?
No, I have no opinion whatsoever. I firmly believe, without any opinion whatsoever, the U.S. government and its actors was 100% in collusion with the Israelis to commit what happened.
Oh, good. Oh, good. Thanks for sharing that, because I feel the exact same way. I mean, as far as to what extent, I mean, I think it was definitely a great extent. This government was completely involved. I mean, I think you have to be really like living in dreamland to just believe that some terrorists from Iraq or wherever did what they did, and just the complete response of after the fact, the response of this country to that act was just, I mean, I was going to say unresponsive, but I mean, the evidence is all right there. I mean, like, look at the way that they acted. I mean, there was all this delay. I mean, and they're doing exercises at the same time that these planes hit the towers. I mean, it's just, I don't know. I feel like it's pretty obvious.
Well, I mean, it's become a de facto pattern of behavior and method of operation for these guys. I mean, even a statistician would tell you that the reality and possibility of every single major uh, event that's occurred in the last few years being simultaneously in occurrence with an exercise dealing with exactly the same subject is astronomically impossible. It just isn't going to happen, and yet it's happened in every single case for the last 3 decades.
You
There's
mentioned,
always some form of exercise or training going on in conjunction with the
yeah.
very act they're supposedly training to prevent.
Right. And I mean, the same thing with the Boston bombing. I mean, there were cops and SWAT people all over the streets.
Exactly. The same
And
thing supposedly with the Colorado theater shooting, the Newtown school shooting. All of these supposedly had some form of exercise going on in the vicinity at the time. Now, when you go back to 9/11, however, there's even more things that point to the fact that the government's involved. You and I, as sensible individuals, would fully understand the fact that no guy in a cave in Afghanistan can withdraw the United States Air Force from its mission of intercepting a hijacked plane.
right.
No guy in a cave in Afghanistan without some sort of either CIA clearance or intergovernmental cooperation can do a rescind order on those aircraft flying to intercept, or a stand down order for the missile defense system at the Pentagon and the White House and all these other things that had to happen before 9/11 could happen. They're not
Exactly.
within the forte or power of a bunch of guys on a hijacked airplane or someone halfway around the world in a cave. This had to have come from the inside, or at least been in conjunction with all this external activity.
Right. Yeah. Because exactly. Like, I mean, the response of the United States. It's like, where the hell were they? I don't know if you have an opinion on when they told George Bush he's sitting there with those kids reading a book, and he just kind of sat there and didn't really get up right away.
Well, why should he get up and act when he knew that he was not a target?
Yeah, he was pretty safe with.
He knew he was safe. He knew that
Yeah.
even though his schedule had been publicized as to where he was, he knew where these planes were going. He knew they weren't, that he was not a target. Why should he panic and run out of the building like he had to be somewhere else?
Well, I mean, the fact
Really
that
wanted to cover the story well. That's what he should have done. And if it had been politically capable in any way, he'd have made the excuse that I had to leave this because if I was a target, then everyone in the school was in danger and I had to leave. That didn't happen. He knew he was not a target. He knew they weren't going to be coming after him. He knew exactly where they were going to wind up. So he
But
didn't leave.
what about the fact that his country was being attacked? I mean, isn't that enough to make you
Well,
say,
he
"Hey,
had to wait for the damage to be done so he could take his excuse in hand to vilify Saddam Hussein and scream weapons of mass destruction and hijacking and terrorism before he could implement the Patriot Act and everything else going to follow?
Yep." Let me ask you about the NDAA. I mean, they were obviously have been using that. I went to a couple of the hearings. They're suing the government of Obama, the two lawyers, Bruce Afrin and Chris Mayers, with Chris Hedges and a few other people are involved, and they feel, or I believe I heard Chris Hedges say that they had to have been using the NDAA all along, detaining people, American citizens, without due process before they even signed the NDAA.
Well, if I may, if I could take just a moment, I'm going to paint a little scenario for you here and see if you would agree or disagree on how this is actually playing out in the real world. When a bullfighter steps into a ring with a bull, that cape that he waves to that bull is only effective as long as the bull pays attention to the cape and not to the guy waving it. We, as the states, continuously wave the Constitution at the federal government, who is the bull, and who has decided long ago not to pay any more attention to the Constitution.
Yeah.
Therefore, he is aimed at goring us. By that thought process, the bullfighter can no longer rely on that cape in any way, shape, or form other than to just potentially distract where the bull can actually see. But it's never going to be a defense against the bull, and it's never going to stop the bull by itself. If you want a solution to the NDAA and all the other things that the federal government is attempting to do, the states need to pull out monetarily, cease and desist funding, refuse to deal with the federal government on any sort of economic and financial level, and arrest the first person that sets foot within the territorial boundaries of any given state for treason, and throw them into a state jail till they rot.
That sounds good to me. I mean, why do you think that isn't being done?
Because no state at the moment has the economic means to do so. Basically, the Fed has siphoned the gold and silver economy out of the country, gave it to private banks and entities around the world. The states have nothing to rely on but paper currency, and they're still relying on the constitutional clause that says they can't print their own money, but they've completely ignored the clause that says they can't take anything except gold and silver coin and pay for a debt. So even the states have abandoned the Constitution for all intents and purposes. Why they're still bothering to wave it in front of the bull like it matters at all is completely beyond me.
Right. You mentioned before, that the cops already have an agenda when, they're getting into an interaction with you. And I'm just wondering, I mean, right, so obviously they're not there to protect and serve. I mean, they already, like you said before, they have it, or they're trained to believe that the public just wants to kill them. I mean, so it made it sound before like you were talking as if the police force is some kind of a corporation that is looking and just seeking some kind of, right, like they already have an agenda and they're seeking some kind of a profit.
Well, yeah, there's a twofold point to that fork there. On one hand, the reason for the escalation is, of course, to entrap you into a higher degree of offense so that they can do more to get you into court and prosecute you and all these things. The motivation for that is twofold. One is we have in America a for-profit prison industry.
Yeah.
Because we have a for-profit prison industry, we now have a market for creating prisoners. The second problem is that once they have you in that system, the entire time you are there, it will be used to treat you like an ATM machine for the benefit and profit of every other entity. For instance, municipalities issue citations and fines and all this stuff. They're nothing more than an illegal form of taxation, but they're justified as being some sort of punitive effort to create a certain behavior within individuals. And that's really what this is all about: control, revenue, and making sure that the dollars flow freely to those that are running all this as a business.
Yeah, it's if you don't mind, I have a copy of, it's called Occupy Finance. It's like a booklet that the alternative banking group of Occupy Wall Street put together. And I was just reading this section in the subway the other day about the private prisons, and it really is like so depressing to read when I was reading it. It says the privatization of prisons in the United States might go all the way back to 1868, when the Civil War, Southern farmers and businessmen turned to convict leasing because they needed a replacement workforce for their freed slaves. However, it took until the 1980s to really get the business revving. It says the United States prison population exploded in the 80s due to, among other things, the war on drugs. And soon enough, the first true U.S. corporate-run prisons went online in 1984. Oh, yeah, this was really like so hard to read. The Correction Corporation of America took over facilities in Tennessee and Texas. So basically, the Corrections Corporation of America, correction officers is a company. This thing that I was reading here is basically saying that, they have stock and everything, and their stock went up. If I could just, securitization of this value has required another stroke of corporate good luck to get moving. Namely 9/11 and the resulting mass increase in the detention of immigrants. Since those attacks, the Correction Corporation of America stock has gone from a meager $4.75 a share to its price as of this writing at $33.37, a tidy 702% increase. The company now has a total market value of $3.86 billion. It says the GEO Group, formerly Wackenhurn Securities, began publicly trading in February of 2002, and its stock has similarly risen from about 5.40 a share to its current price of $33 a share, with a market capitalization of $2.36 billion. And, to think that they're turning corrections and prisons into corporations and that actually have stock.
Yeah, exactly. They're for profit, no question. And you'll find that if you dig deeper into how the systems, even at the local levels, county jails and things like that, are being run, they're running it basically for profit. They're allowing the companies to come in. For instance, if you get taken to jail, the only way to call out from that jail is through a phone system that makes you reverse the charges to the person on the other end. And the minimum charge for taking that call from the person incarcerated is $10.
Really? If I could just read you, there's like one more paragraph. I was really so mad when I was reading this. It says, this means that in the last 13 years or so, these two companies, the CC Corporation, Corrections Corporation of America, and the Wackenhun Securities alone have added around 6 billion of newly securitized value to the money base by displacing pre-existing public institutions and actively lobbying to increase the national rates of incarceration.
Yeah, they want to. That's exactly why every single thing an American does has become criminalized.
And
Everything.
and then I'm almost done. CCA, the Corporation Corrections of America, has actually shamelessly tried to get classified for tax purposes as a real estate investment trust. It says, yes, no longer even pretends to be working towards the rehabilitation of criminals. It just provides real estate services to tens of thousands of customers who are involuntarily residing in its depressing facilities. I mean, I am just like, I mean, the public just has to be completely asleep for this stuff to go on. And
Well, the thing is, though, yeah, they are asleep, and they wish to remain willfully ignorant. They don't want to know because it messes with their paradigm of reality, and most people these days can't deal with that.
Well, it's funny that you should mention that because I'm always talking about the last second to last scene in the original Girl with the Dragon Tattoo movie, where the killer tells the journalist about the victims that he had locked up in cages in his basement when they were eating dinner upstairs. And he's telling the journalist how, like, the victims always think he's going to let them leave and have mercy on them and, let them live. And when they finally get it, that they're going to die, he calls it a precious moment. Like, he says it like it doesn't fit into their scheme of things that he's not going to let them leave. And he's calling it a precious moment when they get it. And I always think of that scene when I think about, the public that just doesn't want to believe this, unfortunate reality that is only going to get worse until it does come up and bite them in the ass. I mean, and by that time, it's just going to be like too late for. I mean, I pray to God that it isn't too late. I mean, when I read things like this, and I see the hold that these corporations, this Correction Corporation of America, and the hold that the for-profit world has on the country, I really start to get like kind of pessimistic about turning it around. I try not to, but it's very difficult. What do you? So you go around and you teach. What are the topics that you teach?
Well, I actually on my radio show I talk about various aspects of Texas law, the Texas Constitution, the U.S. Constitution, and government in general. How the law's being misinterpreted, misimplied, and it's intentional. I also teach a class down at Brave New Books in Austin, Texas, on Sunday afternoons, where I teach people what their rights are, how to exercise those rights, how to behave during public servant encounters, traffic stops, sidewalk stops, basically anywhere, and about how to voice and stand upon your protected rights, and basically how to go to court, handle your case yourself, be your own attorney, so to speak, even in a criminal case, as long as it's not one where you could wind up in jail. But lawyers are not trustworthy. None of them. Absolutely none of them. They talk a good game. They talk a good opinion. But when the pressure's on and fighting the good fight will result in their ability or the loss of their ability to actually remain a lawyer, guess which choice they will take? The client will get thrown under the bus so that their livelihood is not imperiled. That's why I teach people to function without them.
Yeah, that's not, the talk that Krisanne Hall gave at the Save Long Island Forum over the weekend, and she was speaking about James Otis Jr., who was a government attorney, one of the highest posts at the time, who actually gave up the post of the attorney for the government in order to expose the tyrannical law to the people. So I guess we don't have many James Otis Jr. lawyers out there anymore. Is that right, Ed? Did we lose him? Ed?
I think we dropped dead. Let me check. Yep, I've got a song ready. We can go to a song and see
Okay.
if we can get him back.
Okay, we are back from the break and we have Eddie Craig back with us. And I am just going to play one of a video with Eddie Craig. It's from the Peaceful Streets Project.
What they should say to police when the cops stop them. Okay? As long as you're on foot or just walking around downtown or something, there's some basic things you need to understand about your rights when it comes to talking to the police. My recommended set of questions to the officers are very simple. The first one should be, am I under arrest? The second question should be, am I free to go? You should not be able to get the same answer to both of those questions. The courts have made it clear that you're in a custodial arrest once a reasonable individual feels they cannot leave the scene of their own volition. Once you've established that fact with the officer, then you follow it up with, since I cannot leave of my own volition, I must presume that I am under a custodial arrest, and I hereby invoke my Fifth Amendment right to remain silent and my right to assistance of counsel. At which point the officer may attempt to continue his interrogation of you or threaten you with arrest if you won't answer the question. So just be aware of that possibility and then follow that up immediately with, I have invoked my right to remain silent and my right to assistance of counsel. Do you intend to punish me for invoking those protected rights? That will document it for the record that the officer is actually attempting to violate your rights or compel you to do so in order to give himself an advantage over you later. Don't allow that to happen. Once you've invoked your rights, stand on it. Thank you.
What are the 3 rules to remain silent?
Yeah, and once you've done that, rule 4, 5, and 6. Shut up, keep shutting up, and shut up some more. Great. Thank you.
Yeah, that's so why is it so important to remain silent?
Well, it's the purpose of that is so you don't engage the officer in loose lip conversation that would give him either a way to potentially incriminate you or to detain you longer to go on a fishing expedition based upon something you may have inadvertently said. You're not required to answer a police officer's questions. No matter what he tells you, you're not required to answer them. At most, a state law on the books can require you to do no more than give them up to 3 pieces of information: name, address, and date of birth. And for instance, here in Texas, they can only require you to give them those 3 pieces of information if they have already lawfully arrested you for some other offense. They can't charge you with failure to identify in Texas by itself. They have to have already arrested you for some other offense before you can violate the failure to identify statute. Or they have to have already lawfully detained you for some other offense and you gave them false information in response to those questions.
So
that's the only 2 conditions.
So what you're saying is right, like they can't just, ask you what your name, where do you live, and what your date of birth is, and you not answer and then arrest you for that.
Correct.
Okay. So, do you mind speaking about, what originally got you into all of this and the whole property tax stuff? Like, did you find anything out about, what happened to your mom and property taxes?
Well, when I started the research on it and found out all the things that they were required to do, I started going back through everything that they had sent to my mother's house and found out that they hadn't done anything in compliance with the laws that governed what their duties were. For instance, Texas law specifically requires that any assessment of taxes on property must be submitted in writing, and it must be signed and verified by the person that made the assessment. Furthermore, the assessment can only be performed and the numbers are only valid if the individual that signed the form actually did an on-site inspection of the property and all.
Hello?
Now that right there is very telling in the fact that a tax collector can't just come into your house without a warrant. They have no right to enter your property without a warrant. So the question that raised in my mind is, well, how do these people get the right just to walk into somebody's property and start poking around to try to determine what everything is worth so they can tax them for it? So that got me actually digging a little deeper into the statutes and into the various laws and the history and things like that, and come to find out that the only property they can actually tax is property owned by corporations that are used for the purpose of business to generate a private profit. That's it.
So people are not required to pay a property tax in Texas?
Legally speaking, absolutely not.
Really?
And if you think about it, it makes perfect sense. How can you spend your life paying for a piece of property and then some complete and total stranger, whether it be government or your next door neighbor, comes up to you and says, look, because you own this property, I'm going to give you a choice of paying me a rental fee of X dollars per year, or I'm going to use armed individuals and the courts to come and take your property away from you because you won't pay me for it.
Right, it's mafia.
Exactly. It's
Yes.
no more than legalized extortion when it's used against a private individual.
But is it
Now-
legal? I mean, is it legal?
Absolutely not. It's not illegal, or it's not legal.
Right.
But the courts, just like their cohorts in the attorneys' offices that become the judges that sit in these courts, one, they don't read the law. I've proven that to myself and to the attorneys numerous times. Attorneys don't read the law. Everything they do is by osmosis.
then
Well,
how,
I heard another attorney talk about it and he said or she said, so that's what I did.
how do they become attorneys if they don't know the law? I mean, don't you have to know?
Because the only thing they're required to learn to become an attorney is what some judge 100 years ago or 10 years ago or 5 years ago ruled about his opinion of how the law applied in a particular case. That's it. They don't learn the law. They learn the opinion of judges that ruled on certain cases. That's it, not the law. And the problem is even those judges that wrote those opinions, 9 times out of 10 never actually read the law they wrote the opinion about.
Well, that's exactly goes back to that Whitney Harold case where the judge was saying to the jury, you know, the law is as I give it to you. And when they were asking, you know, for the judge to show them the law that requires people to pay income tax, and he never presented it to the jury. He was saying, you have everything you need. The law is as I give it to you.
Exactly. And that is the most abhorrent thing in the judicial system in America today that exists.
I mean, it's like mind-bogglingly disgraceful.
Yes. It is the courts trying to control how the government has control. Basically, what everybody tends to forget is that our entire system of government is set up in separate departments for a reason. They're supposed to be checks and balances. They can only be effective as checks and balances if they remain adversarial. They're no longer adversarial. They have united into a single body opposed to the rights and will of the American people. The courts seek to validate and enforce any power grab that any governmental entity wants on the claim that it needs it to do its job. And that's baloney. But the court's job now, rather than protecting the individual rights and property, is to ensure that they can create and craft an opinion that will allow it to seem legitimate to legalize whatever the government power play is that is being decided.
So everything has turned into for profit. The prisons,
Absolutely.
the justice system, like it's literally completely collapsed.
Absolutely. The reason you can't, for instance, let's take the housing market bubble burst and crash. You cannot get a valid ruling on the fraud that was committed by the lender, the fraud that is being committed by the servicer in any court in the land, because virtually every lawyer or judge is highly invested in real estate property. Their livelihood depends on those investments. Their retirements depend on those investments. They're not gambling in the stock market. They only use a little of their money for that. In order to ensure that they're financially viable for the rest of their lives, these people take that huge amount of money they steal and they go invest it in real estate. They are the people that are on the other side of that deal, dealing with the separation of the note and the mortgage. If they rule that that separation's invalid, their entire investment becomes invalid and it becomes lost, because now it's not backed up by the real estate they invested in. Now it's just a broken promise with nowhere to go, and in fact, they're now financially destitute. That's why you cannot get a judge to agree that fraud has been committed in the real estate industry that caused this housing bubble and this crash.
Yeah, like their whole, Ponzi scheme would come crashing down.
Absolutely.
I mean, how is it that, people that go to law school are willing to accept, or, I mean, are they aware that it's just some judge's rule some years ago and not the real law that they're abiding by? Or, like, why don't they demand,
Lawyers do it for several reasons. First and foremost, it's not in their best interest to buck the system that gives them a job. Ask any lawyer why he is afraid of a judge, because the judge can prevent him from ever winning another case and eventually keep him from getting any clients because he can't win the case.
but it's all fake. I mean, doesn't
Well, of course it's all fake, but that's how the judges maintain their power, is by maintaining control of the attorneys and forbidding them to expose the fakery for what it is. I mean, you can take the most famous high-powered attorney in the entire world, and if you got him to answer you honestly about the system he operates in, he will tell you it is based entirely on fraud.
Right.
Doesn't matter what the subject is, civil, criminal, contract law, patent law, it doesn't matter. Everything in the system is based upon who can be duped into believing what, so that the power play stays in the hands of those that want control.
Unreal. Yeah, it's pretty unreal. Again, over the weekend, we had a really good speakers, and they were talking about how the monetary system is just completely fake, and it's not even, money isn't even printed anymore. It's just digital entries,
Exactly.
just made up out of nothing.
Well, if you really want to get down to the very lowest nitty gritty of everything, that's true of any money system, even one based on silver and gold. The silver and gold coin, even if they existed, only have value because we give it the value that it has. In reality, it's still just metal out of the ground, but it has a value to us because we let it have one. We give it one.
You can't make it out of thin air, at least.
That's a different aspect of it. The fact that you can't change the available amount is one of the reasons why we chose it as a basis of value.
Yeah.
But the fact is that in and of itself, its value is nothing more than what we as living beings give to it.
Well, isn't it rare? Like, isn't it like rarity?
But what would that matter in the grand scheme of things unless there's something we wanted to do with it that we thought we could get someone else to accept our interpretation of its value? You see what I'm saying? It would be just as easy for me to pick up a rock off the ground and say, "Hey, I'll trade you this for that." But again, unless you assign the same value to the rock that I do, you wouldn't make that trade.
Well, how do you feel about, or are you interested in Bitcoin or anything like that?
I am absolutely not interested whatsoever in another type of fiat currency, and that's all Bitcoin is.
Yeah.
And the problem with it is it's computer generated. Anything computer generated can be hacked, reversed engineered, corrupted, crashed, stolen, you name it.
I
It can
worry
be
about
manipulated just as easily as any other group of digits in a computer, which is really what the Federal Reserve is right now.
like I'm finding it hard to believe that eventually the government isn't going to try to take complete control over Bitcoin. Like they're not going to sit by and let people get any leverage without them moving in and regulating whatever, taxing Bitcoin.
Technically, it's not money. So it wouldn't be anything the government would have any say so over whatsoever in that regard. They couldn't tax it. It's not money. The fact that it's simply a medium of exchange between people, they would have absolutely no say so over it anyway. So the only thing they could do is discredit it and destroy it by manipulating it, which they've already done.
Right.
When they caused the Bitcoin value to crash here last year because the banks or whoever bought up a huge amount of it and then suddenly flooded it back onto the market, just like they do with their gold certificates and their silver certificates in order to devalue the purchasing power of gold and silver versus their Federal Reserve funny money.
Yeah.
I mean, again, look at exactly, Bitcoin is a perfect example of what I just said. Bitcoin has value only because somebody is willing to give it one. And someone is willing to say, sure, I will accept that at this value for this thing. It's absolutely no different in that regard to my example of gold and silver. It plays exactly the same way. The major difference is that we cannot create the gold and silver out of thin air.
Isn't the stock market pretty much like that?
The stock market is just all speculation of everything. And then it's manipulation of what's being speculated to ensure a particular outcome for somebody.
So we only have about like a minute or so left, and I just wanted to ask you, how can people find you? What's your website?
Right now, the websites you can go to and look us up is ruleoflawradio.com and logosradionetwork.com. And if you want to see some of the things that we're going to be doing with a site that I'm personally launching for the Patriot community to work with, you can read up about it on the logosradionetwork.com/TAO, Tanga Alpha Omega. The site's going to be called Tao of Law, pronounced Dao in Chinese. And it's all about education and focusing of the Patriot community to get us off of our individual pet peeves and focused on to the source of our problems, the lawmakers themselves that believe they rule us instead of actually work for us.
Exactly, and the public really needs to be educated. And I want to thank you for being on, Eddie Craig, and I would love to have you back on in the future. And keep up great work. Okay, awesome. Bye, Eddie.
Bye-bye.
So we are back from the break, and for the next hour, we're just going to play the recording from the Save Long Island Forum, Bill Still's presentation. He was really passionate. I thought he did a really good job. And then also in the last half an hour, a woman named Krisanne Hall, who I never heard of. I never, I didn't know anything about her. And I thought she gave a really an excellent presentation on the Fourth Amendment and spying. I kind of recorded her talk, maybe like a few minutes into it. So she's already kind of speaking when the recording starts to play. But anyway, here is Saturday morning, Bill Still's presentation at the Save Long Island Forum.
Many of you here have seen a film called The Money Masters.
Yay!
That was one of the first films to wake me up to that.
Testing 1, 2.
Things in the world weren't what I thought. So, you ready?
Yep.
So, it is my great pleasure to introduce the one and only Bill Still.
Yay!
Testing 1, 2. Testing 1, 2. Don't need the feedback.
Check.
You guys are in for a bad surprise.
Uh-oh.
Because I'm talking from here.
That's why I'm mobile. Going mobile.
Okay, I'm deeply honored to be here today. To have been invited to Long Island. You'll forgive me for reading the speech, but I don't know why God put me in this position, but I'm a pathetic speaker. Last night, for those that were here, I lost my place twice. And so I just got to read a speech. I mean, that's who I am. I'm sorry. No one is less qualified to be doing this job than me, but there seems to be nobody else to do it. So, in fact, this might well be the last conference I do. I'm serious. So anyway, I'd like to thank Gigi for putting this together. She's put a lot of her own money into this, and she's not going to get it back. And that's so typical of conferences these days. There's just no money in it, and there's certainly no money in what I do, monetary reform. So, and all the volunteers, you see half a dozen of them, or a dozen of them standing around here, just huge amounts of work go into something like this. And plus, thank you all for coming out today. That's, without you, none of this happens. And we're just confined to YouTube. So,
Just gonna go. Sorry.
okay, we're at a very interesting and confusing point in world financial history right now. Central banks have been strongly encouraged by the BIS. This is a picture of the BIS in Basel, Switzerland that I took about a year and a half ago. It's the central bank of central banks. This just came out on June 23rd in a speech by BIS General Manager Jamie Karuna at the bank's annual meeting in Basel. Easy financial conditions can only do so much. More stimulus cannot revive productivity growth. Adding more debt will not strengthen the financial sector, nor will it reallocate resources needed to return economies to real growth. So what in the heck does that mean? Why this dire warning, primarily to the world's largest economy, the U.S.? Because we're living in a shadow world of economic fiction where numbers are made up to keep politicians in power, and most importantly, to keep the debt money system in power. The advanced economies of the world, the red line on the chart, are now running sovereign debt to GDP ratios, and sovereign debt means national debt. To GDP ratios approaching 120%, and it's growing at about an astonishing 5% per year. Certainly this is wildly unsustainable in itself. In fact, anything over 80% is categorized by the IMF as a drag on economies. Over 90% is considered by the IMF as unsustainable, and yet the major economies are now running on average 120% per year. So what's going to happen? No one can know specifically, but unprecedented money growth is adding to the unsustainability of this problem. So here's the resulting U.S. gross domestic product growth rate. So it looks pretty good, all those nice little blue things above the line. The GDP growth numbers are annualized numbers. So really, with this last one, the one on the far right, where that says 4.1%, I don't know if you can see it or not.
Yep.
That's for the third quarter of last year.
Your projector is slightly in front of, you're kind of leaning in front of it every now and then.
Okay, thanks for saying that. In any case, the 4.1%, you divide it by 4 to get the actual quarterly number. It's an annualized rate, so it's 4.1% per year. The problem with these numbers is, guess what? Quantitative easing injections are now counted as positive economic activity.
Oh my God.
That is, they are counted as part of the GDP. Another thing to consider is that the U.S. population is growing at 3% per year. Therefore, in order to stay even, our domestic economy has to grow at 3% per year, just to stay even. That's the red line. However, we have only hit that number in 6 quarters since the crash in 07-08, and all 6 times it was as a result of quantitative easing. So out of 20 quarters, we've hit our target growth rate exactly 6 times, and that's with QE thrown in there. So how big is the effect of QE? Well, let's take a look at this last number, the 4.1% number. The gross domestic product of the U.S. is about $16 trillion. QE throughout 2013 was $85 billion a month, or about $1 trillion a year. That's exactly 6.25% of GDP. Now let's go back to our GDP graph. So what does our economy look like if 6.25% is subtracted from all these numbers? The red line, the 3% line, needed to stay even with population growth, moves up there. The green line, which represents the new 0% line, moves here. So that means that the U.S. has been in recession since QE started, which was right here, the 4th quarter of 2008. So what's the definition of recession? 2 consecutive quarters of negative GDP growth. Economic depression is defined as either 8 consecutive quarters of negative GDP growth or 1 quarter of a 10% loss in GDP. So either way you want to look at it, if you subtract out QE injections, the U.S. has been in recession for over 5 years now, and a depression for over 3 years. So that's why the BIS is telling nations to stop it. It's not working. It's a giant fake economy that is doomed to failure, global failure. This is a fake economy. Injecting more and more debt money to paper over the problems is just adding to what? The U.S. national debt. This is the debt from 1900 to 2020. We're about here where the blue line is right now. Worst of all, these artificial debt money injections are nothing but economic heroin. Heroin that is killing the real economy. If it was taken away, our economy would fall to levels we haven't seen in 50 years. Okay, so that's the bad news. Now let's start building towards a solution. I'm going to give you a little different look at the sustainability of economic systems. I call it macroeconomics. We're going to look at 4 basic things that you may not have considered in the past, but even when taken individually are very powerful. Number 1, humankind's 2,500-year march towards freedom. What started it, what tends to work, and why. Number 2, the negative effects of over-consolidation of power on national, economic, and political structures. Number 3, a national debt. Is it effective? Is it necessary? And finally, number 4, the money creation power of a sovereign and why it is important. What is the most important political development of the last 2,500 years of human history? It is certainly the development of self-governance, governance of the people, by the people, and for the people. Governance in the public interest, instead of governance in the interest of a single person, family, or relatively small privileged group. In other words, we're going to be able to hear this? Let's see.
Put a microphone there.
Okay, you get the idea. We're gonna pass that one too. Now here you see a Saturday night in a Tehran apartment block with youthful residents calling out for freedom back and forth between the buildings. And once again, this might not be worthwhile. Let's see. Oh, forget it. Suffice it to say, the kids in Tehran, I think 2/3 of Iranians are under 25 years old. They all want to be just like us. They're part of the internet generation. They don't like the theocracy. They don't like the mullahs. They want to be like us. So that's why you see this tendency, this shift towards liberalization right now. Whether it's fake liberalization with the new President Rouhani or not, we don't know yet. But I know one thing for sure. The vast and growing internet generation in Iran is going to wipe them out at some point. And so if they don't liberalize, they're going to go down hard. Okay, this is Rouhani. He was elected by an overwhelming margin. We don't yet know if he's a fake or the real deal, but the Iranian people have spoken decisively for freedom. They should be encouraged by the West. They hate the theocracy. They revolted against it only 18 months ago in the streets, and their students spilled their blood trying to tell the world what they wanted. We didn't help them. So what is this freedom that people are willing to die for to achieve? It's characterized by effective self-governance. Government should be the servant of the people, not the dictator manipulating the public. The people should not fear their government. Instead, they should believe that they can have some influence over the decision-making process. Another of the many attributes of freedom is the rule of law. Government cannot be respected by the citizens unless they perceive the rule of law as something that protects them rather than suppresses them, as something that provides fair and equal justice for every citizen. And remember, it's either the rule of law or the law of the jungle. And no one in this room would voluntarily vote for their families to return to the law of the jungle. By the way, I was shocked last night at the dinner when I debated our friend the anarchist Goldbug. I added this quote last night just for him from none other than J.P. Morgan. As a man of sense, I am a Goldbug and support a Goldbug government and a Goldbug society. As a man of the world, I like confusion, anarchy, and war. This is not a fake quote. This is from a letter J.P. Morgan wrote to his brother. It's a real quote. The third attribute of sustainable self-governance is buy-in, sometimes called the social contract. Buy-in is absolutely critical to the political and economic sustainability of a nation. So, for a government to be sustainable, it must operate fairly or the public will slowly turn against it. Without buy-in, government becomes overwhelmingly expensive, and that's exactly what we see happening today. These shifts in public opinion are subtle, but once they become apparent, they are already so advanced that they are difficult to turn around. I don't have a cold. I don't know what's going on with my voice, but just another... it's impossible to put a date on the emergence of effective self-governance, but let's just say it started here. In ancient Greece with Solon, the lawgiver. Solon was the leader of the city-state of Athens. He's known as the father of the Greek democracy, and if there's any cornerstone of my talk today, it's this section on Solon. Because we can always go back to Solon and be rightly directed on what we should be doing with our own government. About 594, he issued the first constitution to settle long-standing conflicts between nobles and common people. The poor, along with their wives and children, were in slavery to the rich. All land was in the hands of a few. The existing set of laws had been issued by Draco. They were very harsh and favored the oligarchs of the time. To stabilize society, Solon decentralized political power and the money power. He knew that in order for society to be successful, the commoners had to have some power, some money, and the hope of success in order to create an incentive-driven society. Solon abolished slavery and allowed anyone to serve in the legislature. He was also the first to allow commoners to sit on a jury. They had the jury system, for God's sakes, 2,500 years ago. So key to our freedom today. To improve the money supply for the commoners, he ordered forgiveness of interest debt for mortgages once the principal was repaid, and doubled the money supply by calling in all precious coins and having them recoined with only half the precious metal as before. This reinvigorated the Athenian economy and brought on these results. The golden age of Athens. Naturally, the devaluation curtailed imports, but that only boosted internal production and exports, just as it does in nations today, showing the complete fallacy of this whole free trade nonsense upon which the TPP is built and all that stuff. Free trade is not free at all. It's slave trade.
Right.
That's all it is. It's just the reverse.
Exactly. That's right.
Typically, only the oligarchs lose out when protective tariffs are imposed. Did you know that as late as 1900, 90% of the U.S. income of what our government was based in, the income of our government was based on tariffs and excise taxes. That was before the income tax amendment was passed.
Go, Bill.
As I said, typically only the oligarchs lose out when protective tariffs are imposed. But in Greece, they realized that this was a small price to pay for preventing the nation from falling into permanent chaos and lawlessness. The problem today is that the oligarchs know that if they wreck this country, they can jump on their jets and go somewhere else with relative ease. This type of mobility was not available in Stalin's day. And that's the difference. Consequently, Stalin remained popular with all classes of society. As Nobel Prize winner Frederick Soddy would write in 1934, it was recognized in Athens and Sparta, centuries before the birth of Christ, that one of the most vital prerogatives of the state was the sole right to issue money. But of equal importance was another factor. Stalin's reforms created a remarkable sense of civic duty, your country calling. Stalin's personal modesty serves as a powerful example for the rich and powerful of Athens. Government was now being run in the public interest, not just to benefit a powerful plutocracy. In the public interest became fashionable. This fostered a sense of civic duty that is sometimes called patriotic or even self-sacrificial, the willingness to contribute to the public interest. As long as my father worked, my mother was always involved in volunteer work. She was the head of the Red Cross in our county. I'm at the bottom left, the one holding his mouth saying, whatever you do, don't get into the speaking profession. That's known as monetary reform humor. There are very few examples of it, so I milk it as much as I can. Stalin's example cut across the class structure. It was this sense of public duty that helped Athens defeat the Persian army at the Battle of Marathon in 490 BC, where 10,000 Athenians repelled an army of 500,000, the largest in history. All of these attributes of Stalin's rule, every single one of them, has modern-day applicability. In order to fix our economic problems, we must restore the concept of civic duty, or buy-in. This can't be accomplished until government once again begins to serve the public interest. No machinations of central banks can possibly compare to this simple yet irresistible power. At the height of his power, Stalin rejected calls to use his tremendous prestige to make himself a tyrant. This later served as the model for George Washington's rejection of calls to become King of America after winning the American Revolution. Now let's look at our second macro influence, the over-consolidation of power problem. One of the most interesting paradoxes is that there are two opposing currents battling it out in this river of human history. On the one hand, you have this unstoppable will of humans to seek freedom from tyranny. But on the other hand, you have organized efforts to break down nationalism and replace it with globalism. This is always sold to nations as the only way to bring peace to the world and put an end to war. Peace? Well, maybe, but at what price? Certainly this transnational consolidation of power would follow Lord Acton's axiom. Power tends to corrupt, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. I believe that any transnational organization, no matter how benign its original goals may seem to be, will turn despotic. This transnational despotism is no more sustainable than any other form of human slavery. Once they have nothing more to lose, the slaves will revolt. One of the most effective ways to destroy buy-in by the population is for a nation to agree to give up some of its national sovereignty and join a regional governance scheme. So if you're really interested in creating a sustainable governance that will last centuries, my advice would be to follow the ways of Solomon the lawgiver, who boosted national pride, and not those of the United Nations or the European Union. But the same goes for these trade agreements President Obama is currently trying to ram through Congress. One is called the Trans-Pacific Partnership, or TPP. The other is called the Transatlantic Free Trade Agreement, or TAFTA. How many people have heard of TAFTA? Very good, because that had kind of died on the vine and now suddenly is resurrected. President Obama is currently trying to get both TPP and TAFTA out of the hands of Congress by getting Congress to grant him so-called fast-track authority. All of these are direct attacks on national sovereignty, a gross over-consolidation of power. Why do people naturally rebel against them? Because people love their nations. It's an identity that makes them separate from their neighboring countries. It's just like in families. If you grew up in a family of 4 children like I did, everybody tries to find a separate identity. If the firstborn is a model child, for example, frequently the second will rebel against that identity to some extent, to try to become unique, a special human being. We all think we're special. We all know deep in our souls that we were sent here by the Creator to fulfill a special mission that only we were created to achieve. Even these guys. So this is human nature, the necessity to create a distinct, special identity in the world family. Now, when you go attacking that nation-state identity, people don't like it. They tend to rebel against it. That's why the first attempt at global governance, the League of Nations, failed. That's why the United Nations has failed to become an effective form of transnational governance. And that is why the next experiment has been the European Union and these transnational trade agreements. So if humanity will not buy into world government in one big bite, they decided to try to do it in small bites. The EU, the TPP, and TAFTA were born. So what's the result? In Hungary in 2003, when the dangers of centralization of power across national borders was not yet recognized, Hungarians voted for EU membership with 83% of the vote. But Hungary never adopted the euro. They were proud of their sovereign national money, the forint. In late August, the new populist government paid off the last remaining installment of their IMF loans 1 year ahead of time, then kicked the IMF out of the country, and is now considering withdrawing from the EU altogether. Interestingly, a Hungarian publisher just made a deal to publish my book, No More National Debt, on sale outside, into Hungarian, one of the world's most difficult languages. Hungary is best friends in Europe with Poland. Poland joined the EU in 2004. It too never adopted the euro, despite 64% initially favoring it. By 2011, those favoring the euro had slipped to 32%, and last year that plummeted to 22%. Poland today has one of the strongest economies in Europe. The UK, which joined the EU in 1973, has never adopted the euro and may soon try to withdraw from the European Union as the anti-EU political party, UKIP, continues to make huge gains in Parliament. Now, 85% of British laws are no longer made in London, but in the European Parliament. So again, we have these two opposite and very powerful currents of human opinion surging back and forth. It certainly seems to me that the oligarchs of Europe are favoring centralization of power, while the forces of Republican self-governance are waking up to the fact that these centralized power schemes will just leave their nations broke, powerless, and stuck in a national nightmare, such as Greece. This is my iconograph of a dictatorship. Very few people hold most of the power at the top, leaving the rest of us with very little to say at the bottom. Notice that those near the bottom feel very far removed from the decision makers at the top. Attaining increased freedom means moving from a very steep power pyramid to a very broad-based power pyramid, where power is spread out to the maximum extent which is politically practical. That doesn't mean the maximum extent, it means the maximum extent which is practical. And we, the people, get to vote on the rules. Does government look more like this today, where power is spread out broadly amongst the people? Or more like this, where very few people share the political power and the bottom layers feel very far removed from the decision leaders? So yes, power is getting more and more concentrated with every passing year. As a result, most people feel they don't have a say in their governance anymore. And once the public feels that it has no control over their governance, there is no buy-in. So we're at a fork in the road right now. National leaders have to decide which way they want to take their people, and there are only two choices. Will you take your nation down the dark path of ever-increasing control or lack of buy-in through transnational governance schemes, or will you choose the Solonic path of justice and liberty for all under the rule of law and governed by an incentive-driven republic? The third macro factor is sovereign debt or national debt. I'm just going to touch on these last two briefly because I'm almost out of time. I'm getting this guy waving at me already. So what's the problem? What's the problem with the national debt? First of all, there's the interest problem. This is something you rarely hear discussed on television. Why? Because it's such a huge number. In fiscal year 2013, the U.S. will pay about $450 billion of interest on a $17 trillion debt. You never hear that. But a new study by the University of California researcher says that the actual debt is now over $70 trillion. The new figures compiled by Professor James Hamilton adds for the first time the government support for housing and other loan guarantees, deposit insurance, actions taken by the Fed, and government trust funds. Certainly in a rising interest rate environment, interest payments alone could crush the U.S. economy. The second problem I have with sovereign debt is the control issue. Who do nations borrow from primarily? Banks. And what if the biggest banks don't like the policies of the U.S. government 5 years from now? Well, they just might decide to stop creating enough play money to support all this government debt. So this is the first problem with government debt. Remember the proverb, the borrower is servant to the lender. If government is the borrower, it is no longer the sovereign. The lender eventually comes to control the political process as well as the money system of the nation. Political science has devised a word for this condition. It's called plutocracy. One thing is for certain, no truly effective legislation to diminish the power of the biggest banks will ever come out of a legislature that is borrowing from these banks. So, in order to have any shot at developing a Solonic structure which rekindles buy-in of the citizenry, your government cannot be allowed to borrow. Not 1 lira, not 1 pound, not 1 Deutschmark or dollar. Never again from anyone. So now we come to the fourth and last point, the money creation power. Even if your country is not borrowing, there is still a big problem if your banks practice fractional reserve lending. Why? Because this means banks create the vast majority of the nation's money, and guess what? In the US and the UK, that's about 97% of the money supply. The truth is that the only American money are the coins in your pocket. Everything else is created by banks as an interest-bearing debt. Banks are corporations, and corporations are required to maximize their profits. What does this mean? It means that banks will never operate in the public interest. It is an impossibility for them to operate in the public interest. Therefore, you cannot give them the money power. You have to return the banks to full reserve lending. In other words, banks can only loan out $1 for every dollar of capital they have on their books. I know you think most give it to you. They just put digits in your account. Digits they don't actually have. They make it up.
Yep.
They make up 97% of it. And that's worldwide.
Yep. Go Bill.
I agree with Irving Fisher, the head of the Chicago School during the Great Depression in the 1930s. Nationalize money, but do not nationalize banking. We need commercial banks. They provide services we all use every day. They need to be the intermediaries between borrowers and lenders, such as with Islamic banking, not actually the money creators. The way a correct banking system should operate is the government would create all the money in the first instance, get all the seigniorage from that creation. Seigniorage means the profit from creating money. Then the government would sell that new money out to the banks at cost. Then the banks would compete to give the public the best deal. And just to correct a common misunderstanding, no monetary reformer believes that the legislature should have control over the quantity of the money supply. It has to be a separate arm of government, either the Treasury or a properly configured central bank. The abuse of this money creation monopoly in the past, especially for the past 100 years, is what has been the direct cause of the rise of cryptocurrencies, such as Bitcoin and the one in the lower right, Quark. People can't get enough money, and so this is just their natural workaround solution. These cryptocurrencies are really just internet-ready complementary currencies, and I support them wholeheartedly. They are not the ultimate solution, but because they do not uphold national sovereignty, but they are a much needed step and might be the only way to break the power of the money masters at this point. That's it.
So that was Bill Still's presentation on Saturday at Save Long Island Forum. And I, because he makes everything like very, very concise and just it's very simple. The system is fake. If people can understand how simple it is. I mean, of course, the powers that be, they want to keep it complicated. They want to keep you confused. They want to keep your head spinning to keep their, the monetary value to put on the Ponzi scheme that our system is. I don't even think you can do it. But, of course, they don't want that to come crashing down. And so, they'll do whatever they have to do to keep it going. And so the next presenter, Krisanne Hall, I wanted to play because, this woman is really dedicated, and she actually, you can contact her. It's Krisanne is one word, Krisanne, and then Hall. If you look her up, she travels around and gives these presentations free of charge. And I was really impressed, that's dedication. And so I wanted to play her talk. And so here is Krisanne Hall at the Save Long Island Forum from this past weekend.
And progressive educational systems wanting to rewrite history in order to justify an overgrowing, out of bounds government. Now this was actually the opening to Barack Obama's address on the National Security Agency that he just gave on Friday. And I'm going to tell you what, I saw this, I was sitting in the airport, Kansas City International Airport, and I erupted into belly-hurting laughter in the middle of the airport when I saw this. Because I thought to myself, how can a speechwriter do that with a straight face? How? Because this is such a gross distortion of reality. And then you guys are going to hear from Charlotte Iserbit later. She's a hero of mine. She's going to tell you that we have been deliberately dumbed down for way too long. And I realized that the progressive education system that we have been indoctrinated in for generations is going to allow us to believe this. So at the dawn of our republic, A small secret surveillance committee born out of the Sons of Liberty was established in Boston, and the group's members included Paul Revere. And at night, they would patrol the streets, reporting any signs that the British were preparing raids against America's early patriots. Throughout American history, intelligence has helped secure our country and our freedoms. Are you stinking kidding me? Okay, so point number 1. Basics. The Revolutionary War was not fought between the Americans and the British. There were no Americans in the Revolutionary War. They were British colonists fighting against their own government. This was not a foreign war, this was a civil war. Point number 2. The Sons of Liberty were not a governmental agency. The Sons of Liberty were the citizens who were fighting against the government intruding upon their liberty. They were you and me who are outraged by the fact that we have this national security exception that allows the government to say, well, you really don't need to worry about that Fourth Amendment because it doesn't apply to us in this situation. My question is, if the Fourth Amendment doesn't apply to the federal government, then why in heaven's name do we even write it? These are the things that we've got to understand. If we are going to be the truth bearers, because that's what we need. All right, go ahead and go to the next slide. The battle against government intrusion began for us, at least locally, because I travel around the country, I teach the history of our Constitution, and I bring you, how many of you have heard the genealogy that I teach? Okay, so you guys know we go back to 1041, we go back to Edward the Confessor, and I trace the history of our Constitution all the way to the Declaration of Independence. But I just want to stay time-wise local now. And so for us, the history of this battle against government intrusion began in 1761 with a man named James Otis Jr. Now here's the interesting thing about this, because this is the truth, and what Obama said is just totally fiction. James Otis Jr. was a government attorney. One of the highest posts any colonist could achieve in the government, James Otis Jr. carried it. He was in charge of enforcing these writs of assistance and prosecuting people for the crimes based on the searches and seizures. Now, what were these writs of assistance? Writs of assistance were warrantless searches perpetrated on the colonists to search and seize their property to enforce the unconstitutional taxations created by the British government. See, we didn't invent this Fourth Amendment thing, we inherited it. Our framers came here with a well-established protection of their privacy and their property. And the government was totally violating that with these writs of assistance. So what these writs of assistance did was give individual governmental agents the power to determine who to search and what to seize. Open warrants. Knock on your door and say, okay, my name is Agent so-and-so and Colonist Smith, by the authority vested in me by the British government, you will allow me into your home now. They had no authority to refuse legally. And then these agents could literally go into the people's homes through personal motivations and take whatever they wanted and do whatever they wanted with it and arrest people at a whim. And because these were open warrants, the colonists had no way to challenge them legally. But James Otis Jr., a government attorney, began to realize just how tyrannical these writs of assistance were. So he was approached by some of the colonists, and he decided to resign his post for the government and blow the cover on this tyrannical law. So technically, James Otis Jr. was a whistleblower. He argued in a courtroom against the government for 5 solid hours against these writs of assistance. He called them the worst instruments of arbitrary power, the most destructive of English liberty and the fundamental principles of law that ever was found in an English law book. And they're no different than what the NSA and the federal government and the Department of Justice is doing to you now. Because you see, those who do not know their history are doomed to repeat its mistakes.
Amen.
So warrants based upon probable cause. These are the problems that James Otis Jr. had with these warrants. Bare suspicion without oath is sufficient, he said. Well, that's what Patriot Act says. Section 215 in the Patriot Act says we can overthrow the Fourth Amendment's requirement for probable cause and base every search and seizure on mere relevance. I'll remind you that Otis called this the worst instruments of arbitrary power, the most destructive of English liberty, and the fundamental principles of law that ever was found in an English law book. Warrants upon oath or affirmation. That means that every warrant that is issued is based on a single place or a single person, and every warrant must be reviewed by a judge, meaning every single officer must stand before the judge and swear to the veracity of that warrant. They actually do that. I have made warrants as a prosecutor. And there is always a clause. There is always a clause that says, I do hereby swear and affirm that the testimony contained in this warrant is true to the best of my knowledge. Am I right, officers? You see, your police officer cannot go to a judge and say, I want to get a warrant for everyone in my county so that I can search everyone in my county. But that's what these writs of assistance were doing. It is a power that places the liberty of every man in the hands of every officer. And that's exactly what these NSA warrants do too. You see, they go before the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Courts and obtain a warrant that applies to everyone in secret. So you can't know you're being searched. You can't know that your stuff is being seized. And it's totally open-ended, which means every government officer who has this warrant has open authority to come into your home or take your electronic information, and they don't have to answer to it to anybody else. Otis said, what a scene does this open? Every man prompted by revenge, ill humor, or wantonness to inspect the inside of his neighbor's house, make it a writ of assistance. Others will ask it from self-defense. One arbitrary exertion will provoke another until society be involved in tumult and in blood. The funny thing is our framers took this a whole lot more seriously than we do. But the truth of the matter is, the Government Accountability Office did an audit on national security letters, these writs of assistance in our modern day, and found out that in 1 year, 49,000 national security letters were issued. Now remember, we're doing this to keep us safe from terrorists, right? The Government Accountability Office figured out that of those 49,000 national security letters issued, 60% were issued on U.S. citizens and legal resident aliens. That means, according to the government, our greatest terrorist threat comes from you and me.
That's right. Amen.
And they're based on mere relevance. And they're absolutely open-ended. Any agent can use them. And there is no way you can fight them. Because although these writs of assistance that Otis dealt with, there was a gag order by the sword. You do not dare stand up against an agent at your door. These national security letters, how they're seizing all your stuff, contain a gag order. So if you're served with one, you can't tell anybody or you will be federally prosecuted. There's also an arm of these national security letters called suspicious activity reports. That allows the federal government to go in and seize your bank records. In that same government accountability report, they found out that there were 200,000 national security letters issued in 1 year, seizing over 2 million bank records. With numbers like that, you might know somebody who's had their bank records seized, and they will never know it because the bank cannot tell you, because there's a gag order that will federally prosecute your bank for letting you know that the government's been in your records. Not only that, before Janet Napolitano fled office, she issued a report that said these same suspicious activity reports allowed the government to go into your safety deposit boxes and seize anything that they find merely relevant or suspicious. And the bank can't tell you that they've been there, and they can't tell you it's gone because there's a gag order. Particularly describing the places to be searched and the things to be seized. James Otis Jr., in his legal argument, said, a man's house is his castle, and whilst he is quiet and he is as well guarded as a prince in his castle, this writ, if it should be declared legal, would totally annihilate this privilege. Do you understand that these national security letters, this search and seizure by your federal government, takes away your liberty and your security in your home? It really, literally makes you the possessor and owner of nothing. What it means is the government owes everything that you own, and you merely possess it temporarily with their permission. He said, custom house officers may enter our houses when they please. We are commanded to permit their entry. Their menial servants may enter, may break locks, bars, and everything in their way. And whether they break through malice or revenge, no man, no court can inquire. Do you see this history repeating itself? But you know what alarms me more than that? We now have generations of people who will never ever know anything but government control and intrusion. Raising up generations of people who believe that it's a matter of national security for the government to own and possess everything that you own and possess, based on their desires and their relevance. This is why this education is so important. Go ahead. The purpose of the Constitution. We've got to get back to some basics. The purpose of the Constitution is not to create the federal government. The purpose of the Constitution was to preserve liberty. Read the preamble. Preserve the blessings. It gives you a whole list of things that we're going to do. Why? To preserve the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity. Not the creation of the federal government, but to preserve liberty. But we've somehow allowed our history to be rewritten and our education to convince us that liberty can be traded for security. Through the Constitution, we created a union of the states. You see, the Constitution is a contract that was agreed to voluntarily by the states. Not forced, but voluntarily, a binding contract that they agreed to, and in that contract they created and defined a limited federal government. So now I'm going to ask you a question. Go ahead. A federal government not limited and defined by the people. A federal government whose only limitation is its own will is not a constitutional republic. It's a totalitarian kingdom. And so when you have the federal government that can look you in the eye through the court system or through its agents and say, well, that Fourth Amendment really doesn't apply to us. It really doesn't mean what you think it means. It means what we think it means. What you've got is a government that can define its own limitations, which means the only limitation the federal government has is its own will. And now you have a government who is not deriving its just powers from the consent of the governed, but a government who derives its powers from its own will, and that is a kingdom. Now this is not a right-left thing. This is a liberty-tyranny thing. This is a good and evil thing. Because our conservative Republican House is just as guilty, if not more, for destroying our liberties in the Constitution. It was our conservative Republicans that gave us the Patriot Act. It's our conservative Republicans in the House that, by their own admission, will continue a program under a president that they hate. There was a town hall meeting in which Michelle Bachmann, Justin Amash, tried to eliminate the ability of the NSA to get into our stuff. A simple, direct, and pointed amendment that would have removed their ability to take your stuff without a warrant. Michelle Bachmann stood before a town hall and said, I am vehemently opposed to Justin Amash's amendment because your emails and your cell phone conversations don't belong to you. She said they're business records of the cell phone companies and the email providers. And since they don't belong to you and they're business records, then we can seize them under an exception to the Fourth Amendment. The business record exception. Justin Amash stood up and just brought out, well, if we live in a country where my emails and my cell phone conversations don't belong to me, we're worse off than we think we are. I want to say, yeah, Justin, we're way worse off than you think we are, because our property, our persons, our houses, our papers, and effects already don't belong to us. These laws, the Patriot Act, NDAA, all of these things make our possessions ours only through the permission of the government. And they can just take them as they please through mere relevance or suspicion. What kind of government do you want? A republic or this? So here are your solutions. Because I'm not just out here to be angry. I don't believe that all we need to do is be angry. I believe that we need to act. And we need to act as individuals and stop looking to the federal government to fix itself. Have you figured out the federal government is not going to fix itself? Let me give you this now. And you know what? Changing out who is up there is not going to fix it either. Our federal government is like a car we've been driving in. And we've just realized we're broke down on the side of the road. We haven't been going anywhere for a very, very long time. So we hop out the car, we pop the hood, and we figure out all the hoses have been slashed and the wires have been pulled out. And all this time we've been figuring we could get the car to drive again by simply changing out the drivers. It's time for us to elect mechanics. People who are proficient in constitutional principles, not those things that they learn in law school, but the things that the framers of this country knew through experience and wrote reams about. Jefferson said that the several states who formed the Constitution, being sovereign and independent, have the unquestionable right to judge of its infractions, and that a nullification by those sovereignties of all unauthorized acts done under the color of that instrument is the rightful remedy. Your states are sovereign and independent entities. Go read the Declaration of Independence in the last paragraph. It'll prove it to you. We started off as sovereign, free, and independent countries with the same power as Germany, France, and Spain, and Great Britain. Creating the Union did not change that. The 10th Amendment preserved that. So what we have to do here is understand that not only do the states have to nullify, but we have to do this on an individual basis through your counties, through your municipalities, and you as an individual as well. Now, I'm going to prepare you to defeat these arguments against nullification. Because when your state stands up and says, we are not going to allow these NSA searches to our citizens, we are not going to permit NDAA to be enforced here, these are the things that you're going to hear. It's not in the Constitution. The Supreme Court said no, and the Supremacy Clause prohibits it. So, it's not in the Constitution, but James Madison and Samuel Adams knew it to be right. Because it is in the 9th Amendment. The 9th Amendment reads, the enumeration in the Constitution of certain rights shall not be construed to deny or disparage others retained by the people. Your 9th Amendment is the most important clause in the entire Constitution. Your 9th Amendment is what makes us a republic and not a kingdom. The 9th Amendment declares that every right in the universe belongs to you. It's not given to you by the government. It is yours inherently. Sam Adams gives us some further information about this, understanding of this. Among the natural rights of the colonists are these. First, a right to life. Secondly, to liberty. Thirdly, to property, together with the right to support and defend them in the best manner they can. 4, life, liberty, property, and defense of those things. Nullification is in the Constitution. Why? Because it's your inalienable right to defend your life, liberty, and your property. These NSA seizures, these NDAA intrusions, the Department of Justice through its white paper telling you they can assassinate anyone they want, anytime they want, and the courts can't say anything, are all direct attacks on your life, your liberty, and your property, and you have an inherent right to protect those from anyone, foreign or domestic. They'll say SCOTUS, that's Supreme Court of the United States. That's our little lingo abbreviation we use for the Supreme Court. SCOTUS is the final say. Next slide. Jefferson says, oh, look, my picture fell off. That's not supposed to be like that. Success Jefferson had on his mind when he was talking about this. The idea that the general government is the exclusive judge of the extent of the powers delegated to it stopped nothing short of despotism. Since the discretion of those who administer the government, your NSA, FBI, DHS agents, since the discretion of those who administer the government and not the Constitution would be the measure of their powers. Madison, I love this. Madison gives you just a right punch in the nose to the Supreme Court. He says if the decisions of the judiciary be raised above the authorities of the sovereign parties to the Constitution, who are the sovereign parties of the Constitution? The states. So if the decisions of the judiciary be raised above the states, dangerous powers not delegated may not only be usurped and executed by other departments, but that the judicial department also may exercise or sanction dangerous powers. So we don't even allow the Supreme Court to even do with these things. We just do foreign intelligence surveillance courts, which are even outside the entire due process system. He says, consequently, that the ultimate right of the parties to the Constitution, who are the states, to judge whether the compact has been dangerously violated, must extend to violations by one delegated authority as well as by another, by the judiciary as well as by the executive or the legislative. Because you see, Some people are going to say, well, nullification, you can't do that because the Supreme Court said so. But if the Supreme Court can judge and determine what the limitations of its own power is, and what the limitations of the other branch's power may be, then the Constitution no longer rules the federal government. It's the federal government rules itself. Some will say the Supremacy Clause prohibits it, which I love this argument, because I don't believe that we can, I don't believe in calling people names. I think the minute you start yelling at people and calling them names, you prove that you're ignorant and you have no argument. So, I don't call people names. I believe they classify themselves. And when somebody says to me the Supremacy Clause says nullification is not allowed, they show me just how illiterate they are, because the Supremacy Clause is very, very easy to read. See, Hamilton said in Federalist 78, no legislative act, therefore, contrary to the Constitution, can be valid. Now, we live in a society where we like to redefine the meaning of the word is. But the last time I checked, that's a very clear and concise sentence. And no still means no. But Hamilton says if we deny this, if we allow legislative acts contrary to the Constitution to be valid, what we're doing is allowing the deputy to be greater than the principal, the servant above his master, and the representatives of the people superior to the people themselves. And then they'll say I have the power to do this because I said so. The Supremacy Clause is also very clear to read. This Constitution and the laws of the United States, which shall be made in pursuance thereof, shall be the supreme law of the land. That is not an unlimited declaration that everything that Congress does is the supreme law of the land. This is a qualifying sentence. So the Constitution is clearly, by itself, the supreme law of the land. But the laws made in Congress are only the supreme law of the land if they are made in pursuance to the Constitution, which is simply a reiteration of what Hamilton said. No legislative act, therefore, contrary to the Constitution, can be valid. Our founders did not accept this tyrannical intrusion upon their inherent rights. This is what Otis said in his legal argument. I will to my dying day oppose with all the powers and faculties God has given me, and all the instruments of slavery on one hand and villainy on the other, as this writ of assistance is. These national security letters, these NDAAs, all of these things are exactly the same thing, and in their day, they were willing to fight. And we should not accept them either. My favorite founding mother said this: we will stand against tyranny today, or our children will bow tomorrow. Because you see, the young people are the real sufferers of our ignorance and our compliance and complacency. Because they're the ones that are going to have to fight.